UK and beyond. Newsnight with Emily Maitlis.
A cold murder, a cover-up, 3 decades of failed police investigations and a £60 million bill. Tonight, the Met Police is accused of institutional corruption for prioritising its reputation over solving a heinous crime. Why was the killer of Daniel Morgan never found, and why were so many grievous errors made along the way? Tonight, a 1,200-page report finds the Met was more interested in protecting itself. We hear from those involved at the time. Also tonight, the Trade Secretary insists the Aussie deal will benefit British farmers.
We'll also be putting in more support in terms of counsellors overseas to help sell those fantastic British products. We're already seeing rising levels of sales into those markets right across Asia Pacific, where prices are higher for products like lamb and beef.
Is she right? We ask a farmer and a supporter of the deal. And 2 weeks until the battle for Batley and Spen, how did this 2-horse race become a little 3-legged? And what's it doing to Labour's chances? Good evening. What can you say to the family of a man murdered 34 years ago who've never seen his killer brought to justice? What can you say to the family of a man who've seen 5 police inquiries come and go without success? What can you say to the family of a man who've driven the search for truth for decades, convinced they were the only ones who were committed to finding out what really happened? Today, the family of Daniel Morgan finally heard the words they felt they'd known all along, that the Met Police Force was guilty of institutional corruption, that the force had put its own reputation above a murder investigation, that it had abused its power and the public's trust. This is a story about a murder that is now unlikely ever to be solved, but it's also about how the most powerful police force in the land chose to shield its own. This time there was no AC-12. Katie Razzle has been studying the findings of an 8-year-long report as an independent inquiry finally came to a close.
He was a good friend to me. He would always help me. We were always ready to help each other.
For 34 years, his family have battled to find out what happened to Daniel Morgan, the private investigator murdered in gruesome circumstances in a South London pub car park in March 1987.
Ever since this incident, I just don't feel comfortable here. I don't trust Britain any longer.
Today, the independent panel that looked into the killing accused London's Metropolitan Police of institutional corruption. Reputation came before the truth, the panel says.
By not acknowledging or confronting, over the 34 years since the murder, its systemic failings or the failings of individual officers, by making incorrect assertions about the quality of investigations, and by its lack of candour, which is evident from the materials we have examined, we believe that the Metropolitan Police's first objective was to protect itself.
Daniel Morgan's detective agency was above a high street shop, a very ordinary location, but Southern Investigations, as it was called, had been linked to corrupt police officers. Yet the panel says that despite allegations at the time that Mr. Morgan was about to make public what he knew about police corruption, that was never seriously investigated by the Met. The police didn't look at the theory that officers involved in lucrative corrupt practices had worried their careers were under threat and may have been involved in the murder. 10 former police officers connected to Morgan's circles were later convicted and imprisoned of other serious crimes. The panel says it's very probable suspects had warning that they were about to be arrested, giving them the opportunity to ensure that no incriminating material, should such have existed, was to be found. It also accuses the Met of a lack of cooperation as the inquiry carried out its work.
There's no joy in finding out that the Metropolitan Police are guilty of institutional corruption, but the fact is it's true. And for me it means, well, I was right, and I've been shouting about this for 34 years.
Do you believe that the person at the top of the Met now, Cressida Dick, should stand down, consider her position?
Yeah, I think she should be considering her position, but she is no worse than many of the other commissioners under whose tenure this corruption has been going on.
It's taken 8 years, cost more than £16 million, and the 3 volumes of the panel's report stretch to 1,251 pages. The inquiry didn't have legal powers to compel witnesses to give evidence, and it says some people refused, in some cases for fear of reprisals. It's a tantalising insight into how, even 34 years on, Daniel Morgan's murder is still shrouded in secrecy.
Daniel Morgan was killed with an axe in the Golden Lion pub car park in Sydenham. The inquiry lays bare a catalogue of failings in the many investigations that followed. That began on the night when the police failed to search the scene and left it unguarded, which meant potential evidence was irretrievably lost. Alibis for some suspects weren't sought, and forensics are described as pathetic.
I think it'd be unfair to judge the Met on the basis of this case. This was an absolute disaster from cradle to grave, and I think the Met missed real opportunities right at the beginning. You solve crimes in 3 key ways. You get a confession, you listen to witnesses, or you get forensics. The forensics were not managed, so it was a pitiful state of affairs. And I think the Met just was always playing catch-up after that. Added to that, the issue around the individual officers who were known to have corrupt links, who were involved in the investigation. I mean, it just didn't stand a chance.
The family deserves a fulsome apology, says the inquiry. The Met Commissioner, Cressida Dick, issued an early statement saying she'd been determined her force cooperate with the panel. And this from the Met's Assistant Commissioner.
I do want to again apologise for our repeated failure to bring those responsible for Daniel's murder to justice. And I recognise that that failure has only added to the pain and anguish the family have felt. My sense of the Metropolitan Police Service is that every single day its men and women go out to do the best they can to provide service to Londoners in terms of emergency response, crime investigation, visible patrol, reassurance and engagement. And I don't see that as a picture of a corrupt service.
The inquiry says it cannot conclude from the evidence it's seen that there was police involvement in Daniel Morgan's murder, and the case remains one of the most investigated and most costly unsolved murders in Met Police history. The tragedy, says the panel, is that it could and should have been solved. Its report is a serious indictment of British policing.
Do you think you'll ever see justice?
No. I mean, I wouldn't even bank a minute's hope on it, They can't say anything to me to restore my trust. They have to act, penalties, accountability. And it's a rare thing in this country, I think, with police accountability.
Well, Alistair Morgan was ending that report by Katie Razzle. We did ask the Met to join us tonight. They couldn't. Joining us now, former Attorney General Dominic Grieve, the former Met officer, and the Crime Watch presenter Jacqui Hames, and founding member of Scotland Yard's Undercover Unit and author of To Catch a Killer, Peter Bleksley. Welcome to you all. Jacqui, if I can start with you, because your role in this was one of many very complicated strands, but you were a Met detective, you were a contributor to Crime Watch, you were asked to join the new investigation into Daniel's murder. Just take us through what happened to you at that time.
Yeah, I actually played no part in the investigation, Emily. I was, as you say, a presenter on Crime Watch, but also a serving officer. But I was married to a Detective Chief Superintendent who took on one of the later investigations and actually made an appeal on Crime Watch. And it was as a result of that appeal that flagged up to the suspects that were being investigated at the time the new investigation was going full throttle, and listening to those suspects talking, we ended up as a family being targeted by those suspects and put under surveillance, in fact, surprisingly, as it turned out, by, in fact, employees of the News of the World. And it actually showed the connections between Southern Investigations, which is the private investigation company that Daniel worked for with his partner, Jonathan Rees, and the News of the World and the murder inquiry. And as we will have all have heard today, quite shockingly, Nuala O'Loan's opening remarks said that the panel found significant and unlawful interactions between the media and the police, which could have caused risk to life. And that was, to me, was hugely shocking, on top of the 34-year-old wait that poor Alistair and his family have had to cope with. waiting for answers, and I'm not sure we got enough today.
Did you ever get answers to who put you under surveillance? I know that we heard from the report there wasn't hard evidence, but there was strong circumstantial evidence of who sold details. I think it was to News of the World.
Well, unfortunately, because this was a panel of inquiry and not a public inquiry, is what it should have been. But no, we didn't get full answers to that. There were proven links between the news editor at the News of the World ordering the surveillance on us, and there is very strong links to Southern investigations and the suspects in the murder inquiry, as you say, provided strong evidence that there was some sort of collusion in order to derail this inquiry, which is truly shocking. And perhaps one of those things that, in terms of the cover-up, caused the Metropolitan Police to take this action to delay the inquiry, to cover up what's happened. And as so often happens, it's the cover-up in many cases that is incredibly shocking and damaging over a long period of time to one of our national institutions and our, premier police force.
Yeah. And Peter Blexley, you were in the heart of one of those national institutions, Scotland Yard's undercover unit, founding member at the time. What is your sense of what this report has said today?
This is yet another very dark day for the Metropolitan Police, and it comes hot on the heels of quite a few others in recent times. Of course, it's a dreadful day for the Morgan family, and my sympathies go to them. But this, to me, smacks of what I hear the lower ranking officers are often so irritated about, and that is that as senior officers climb that greasy pole of promotion, policing to them becomes more about self-service than public service. This evening, when I listened to Cressida Dick and Assistant Commissioner Fgrave, I've not seen 1 ounce of contrition. I've seen media-trained and lawyer-briefed senior police officers. That's how I've seen them. There should be outrage amongst the corridors of Scotland Yard today. Outrage at this report. Outrage that it could ever have happened, and outrage that the report has been obstructed in recent times as well.
I guess Cressida Dick feels, and I don't want to speak for her, but I imagine that she feels her job today is to reassure the public that most of the people serving in that force are incredibly good and diligent at their job, and this was a long time ago. Do you not buy that?
Without doubt, the rank and file, the detectives and the police officers on the front line doing that everyday hard graft and putting their lives at risk are far less corrupt than they were in the dark days of the late 70s and the early 80s and beyond when I was serving. And credit needs to go to the Metropolitan Police for addressing that. There are, of course, pockets and individuals, as recent convictions have shown, which means that the Metropolitan Police is far from being whiter than white. But great progress has been made, and I acknowledge that. However, when a damning report like this says that the Metropolitan Police corruptly protects its own position, its own reputation, before tirelessly searching for the truth, which is what it should do, then that is a dark, dark stain indeed.
Dominic Grieve, one of the most, I suppose, damning things that we heard from Alistair Morgan this evening was that he said, the brother of Daniel, I don't trust Britain any longer. Now, I guess in his mind, he is sort of seeing the police, the state, the politics, the media, all as one entanglement.
That's quite understandable. I think that what comes out of this report for me, having looked at it, is that, yes, there was an issue of probably localised corruption at its origin. But I agree that behind that, there is much wider sense that the Metropolitan Police was unable to respond appropriately to the magnitude of the inquiry they had to carry out and to what had happened. And we've seen this. This isn't just the police. We see this over and over again. My experience in government is that actually UK government and its institutions and public services try to do the right thing. But when something goes wrong, the tendency to try to cover it up the tendency to try to avoid openness becomes very marked. I've seen it with some of the work I did in the Intelligence and Security Committee. And that, I think, is troubling, and it calls into question, why does that culture exist? And I think we have to ask ourselves some quite hard questions about this. It may be that because we have a highly blame culture, it means that people admitting they're getting things wrong, they're not prepared to do. And the consequence is that we don't get put right what has gone wrong. We just try to brush it under the carpet. And I think that's what I would say ministers should be focusing on. And that requires honesty at every level, including, I might add, from ministers.
And can I ask Jacqui Hames, when you said you didn't actually get onto the investigation, but did you recognise that culture of being told, have a look, but don't look too hard, be careful what you actually find? Was there always something that was kind of hinted at that you shouldn't be investigating this particular case, or maybe others?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because I'm of similar era to Peter. In fact, we served together at one stage in the late 70s, early 80s. As a woman in that rather strange environment, I wasn't trusted immediately, and there was certainly an undercurrent on occasions, and I would say it's very rare. It was rare. I didn't come across it very often, but there were on occasions things would happen that you were told to ignore and avoid, and that your career and job were on the line if you didn't. I don't believe that happens today, but clearly there are occasions, and we saw it with leaking of evidence from murder inquiries to the press and this sort of thing. There are still no doubt occasions where police officers are corrupted and police staff in order to leak information is a strong example, which actually could, in this day and age, derail murder investigations exactly the same. And as Peter says, what happens? Reputational damage, let's cover it up. And I think we need to get away from that culture.
Peter, you don't think this is still happening now? You don't think we still have the same problems of institutional corruption and cover-up, do you?
The corruption at the coalface is nowhere near the levels that it was back in the 1980s and into the 90s. That has largely been addressed, and we all as a public ought to be pleased with that, although from time to time transgressors are found, thankfully. With regards to protecting reputations, you can say that of virtually every police force in the country. Speak to any journalist, any investigative writer like myself, anybody who tries to get information legitimately through Freedom of Information Act applications, for example, from a police service, will be told that we're acting in a vexatious manner. They will pull down the shutters. They will do everything they possibly can to stop the truth from being told to people like me.
They're a they now, are they? I mean, do you feel you sound almost more like a member of the media now, sort of asking the questions rather than as a member of the force? Do you have no sense of I guess, loyalty to where you were?
None whatsoever. No, of course not. I've long since left the police, and I'm an investigative writer these days, and I want to find the truth. I write about murders. I spend lots of time with people who have lost a loved one to murder. We need a victims' law, but that's a completely different debate.
Let me ask you, Dominic Grieve, because you raised this question of blame and accountability, and I said at the beginning, this isn't line of duty. We don't have AC-12 here. Does the police have the ability to investigate itself properly, or does the Independent Commission do that job well enough?
The Independent Commission is certainly an improvement on what we had in the past. But as I said, I think there is a culture which is quite prevalent in the United Kingdom that we can't accept very readily, that we make mistakes. So as a result, because the consequence of admitting a mistake is reputationally very damaging, there is a tendency to cover mistakes up. And you could argue that's partly the fault of the media, that the inflammatory nature of the admission of making a mistake means that people can't readily come forward and say, we got this wrong. Right. And as a consequence, we end up with cover-ups. And my experience in government is that the sorts of problems which came up, not just with the police, but in other sectors as well, it was always the issue of not being able to be open about what had gone wrong and then taking the right steps to remedy it. So I think there's quite a wider issue If I was asking my ex-colleagues in Parliament, I'd say, go away and think about that. Because once you've got that right, then I think that some of the issues which have arisen in this dreadful case would not have happened.
And I should say we did also ask News UK to speak to us this evening. They declined our offer, but thank you to all our guests very much. Thanks for coming in, Peter.